At exactly 4:17 a.m. in the Strait of Hormuz, the Combat Information Center on the lead U.S. destroyer went quiet in a way sailors hate. Not the calm kind of quiet. The kind that happens when a radar screen shows something it shouldn't, and every operator is suddenly afraid to blink. One faint return, right on the edge of the clutter, drifting where only empty water was supposed to be. And then, almost immediately, another, and another. Within seconds, everything changed. Outside, the night was black oil and moonless sky, the sea barely breathing. But inside the steel hull, the glow of consoles painted faces a sickly blue. A watch officer leaned in, voice low. Range? Speed? Classification? The answer came back uncertain, and uncertainty is how wars begin. Because what the crew didn't realize at 4:17 was that they were already being watched from beneath the surface. The Strait of Hormuz is not just water. It's a narrow, strategic funnel connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, with Iran to the north and the Omani Musandam Peninsula to the south. At its narrowest point, it's only about 30 miles across, a choke point that compresses civilian shipping and naval power into lanes that can be surveilled, threatened, and, if someone is desperate enough, shut down. In daylight, it looks manageable, even ordinary. At night, it becomes a corridor of shadows, where distances feel smaller than they are and intentions are impossible to read. Tonight, a U.S. Navy carrier strike group was moving with deliberate patience, not rushing, not lingering. The aircraft carrier sat at the center like a floating city, surrounded by escorts, a cruiser, and multiple destroyers, Aegis radars sweeping constantly, helicopters staged, fighters ready on deck even if the carrier's lights were masked and dimmed. The Americans had done this before. Plenty of times. They knew the script of the strait, the Iranian speedboats that appear too close for comfort, the drones that buzz the horizon, the radio calls in accented English, the feeling of being inside someone else's front yard. It's the kind of place where the rules of peace are written in pencil. But at 4:17 a.m., something else entered the story. On the destroyer's screens, the surface picture was never clean. In literal waters like these, you don't just watch for ships. You watch for sea-skimming missiles, low drones, slow helicopters, and fast-moving small craft that can hide in the clutter until the last moment. That's why some U.S. ships carry systems like the AN/SPQ-9B, an X-band pulse Doppler radar designed for the literal environment, scanning to the horizon with strong clutter rejection, and the ability to detect low-flying anti-ship cruise missiles and surface threats at the same time. The Strait is exactly the kind of environment it was built for. Yet the returns at 4:17 weren't coming in like a missile. They weren't moving like speedboats either. They were wrong, faint, then sharper, then multiplying. At 4:18 a.m. on the carrier itself, an officer in the Carrier Air Wing's night watch took a headset call. A simple update from the escort. Unusual surface contacts, investigating. The words were calm, but the tone underneath wasn't. At 4:18 and 30 seconds, the cruiser's Aegis system automatically tried to make sense of the picture. The AN/SPY-1 radar, a phased array workhorse integrated into the Aegis combat system, was built to provide search, detection, tracking, and discrimination data for air and surface targets, and to support interceptors if threats turned real. It could track aircraft, cruise missiles, even ballistic missiles depending on configuration, but it still relied on one thing, that the environment made physical sense. And for the first time that night, the environment did not. Now here's the part most people miss when they imagine a naval standoff. It's not the shooting that creates panic first, it's the ambiguity. Because ambiguity forces a commander to choose between two nightmares, reacting too slowly and taking a hit, or reacting too fast and starting a war. At 4:19 a.m., a message came in from an airborne asset far to the south. Routine at first, then clipped and sharp. A P-8 Maritime Patrol aircraft had detected an unusual pattern near the shipping lanes. The words, "possible surface anomaly," were used. And in a place like Hormuz, those words carry weight. The carrier's strike group was moving through a world of civilian vessels too, tankers, container ships, local dhows with small engines, everything squeezed into traffic separation lanes and adjacent zones. One wrong identification, and you don't just sink a boat, you detonate an international crisis. But what happened next shocked everyone. And at 4:20 a.m., exactly 3 minutes after the first abnormal return, one of the destroyer's sonar technicians reported something that didn't fit the surface picture at all. A low-frequency pulse, irregular, almost like an animal. Then a pause. Then another pulse, slightly different, as if something was listening and responding. Not a submarine, too shallow, too close to the lanes. Not a natural sound either, too patterned. The watch officer's mind snapped to a word no one liked saying out loud in Hormuz: mine. Mines in the Strait are not history, they're a living fear. In 1988, during the tanker war era, Iran deposited approximately 150 mines in the Strait of Hormuz, and one mine, described as World War I vintage, nearly sank the USS Samuel B. Roberts. That single fact lives in U.S. naval memory like a scar. It proved something brutal. Mines don't need to be sophisticated to be effective, and clearing them can take time the world doesn't have. At 4:20 a.m., the strike group didn't know whether this was a mine, a decoy, or something worse. But they did know one thing: someone wanted them to doubt the water beneath them. Then came the curiosity that keeps analysts awake years later. At 4:20 and 15 seconds, the strange sonar pulses stopped completely, as if whatever had made them had gone silent on purpose. And that silence was the loudest sound in the room, because if it wasn't an explosive mine, then what was it? At 4:21 a.m., the carrier's bridge received a secure update. The destroyer had requested permission to deploy a helicopter for rapid investigation, an MH-60R type response, so the kind used to quickly check contacts and drop sensors if needed. The carrier's captain allowed it, but with conditions: keep distance, do not provoke, do not cross into escalation. On the Iranian side of the strait, miles away along the coastline and among the islands, there were men who had been waiting for this exact moment. They didn't need to match the U.S. Navy ship for ship. They didn't need to defeat the carrier in a straight fight. In a narrow strait, you don't win by punching through armor. You win by blinding the opponent, confusing them, forcing them to move where you want. And tonight, Iran wasn't relying on one weapon. It was relying on an idea. A weapon that doesn't just explode. A weapon that informs. A weapon that whispers target data without ever revealing itself. At 4:21 and 40 seconds, the MH-60 lifted off from the destroyer's deck, rotors biting the humid air. It flew low over dark water, searching for something that might not want to be found. On the horizon, merchant ships were dull silhouettes, their running lights faint, their crews unaware that a modern fleet was holding its breath nearby. At 4:22 a.m., the helicopter crew spotted something, barely visible, bobbing low like debris. A small object, cylindrical, not a buoy that belonged to any recognized pattern. No markings visible from that distance. The pilot circled, and in that moment the object did something no drifting debris can do. It turned, slightly, against the current. Not much, not enough for a casual observer to notice, but enough to make the aircrew feel the hair rise on their necks. It wasn't drifting, it was positioning. Within seconds, the helicopter's crew transmitted what they could. Unknown floating object, possible unmanned device, possible mine-like behavior. Their words were careful, but in the CIC, careful words still landed like a hammer. At 4:23 a.m., the strike group began a subtle maneuver, not a turn that screamed fear, a gradual adjustment, enough to widen distance from the suspected object without appearing to retreat. The carrier's immense mass responded slowly, like a continent changing its mind. And that's when the 1 minute later truly began. Because at 4:24 a.m., 1 minute after the helicopter confirmed the object was not drifting, the Aegis displays across the formation lit up with a different kind of problem. Air tracks, multiple, low, fast, not high-flying aircraft, not civilian. The returns hugged the horizon, and the worst possible profile for an anti-ship threat, the kind of flight path designed to hide in sea clutter until the final moments. The AN/SPQ-9B, built to scan to the horizon and detect low-flying anti-ship cruise missiles and surface threats, now had its nightmare target. The watch officer on the cruiser didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice tightened, and the room moved like a machine. Possible sea skimmers, bearing, range, track quality improving. On another screen, the SPY-1 radar system began refining its picture, doing what it was designed to do: search, track, discriminate, feeding the combat system with the data needed to fight if the order came. But the strangest part wasn't that the tracks appeared. It was how they appeared. Not from deep inland, not from a known launch corridor. They seemed to rise from the sea itself, as if the water had opened and released them. And suddenly that mysterious floating cylinder wasn't just suspicious. It looked like a marker, a beacon, a targeting node. In public sources, Iran fields anti-ship cruise missiles like Noor and Qatar variants, sea-skimming weapons designed for ship targets, with models described as using inertial navigation and active radar homing in the terminal stage, and ranges varying by model. The Noor is described as a reverse-engineered C-802 lineage missile with sea-skimming flight and terminal active radar homing. And the Qatar is described as an Iranian anti-ship cruise missile development, with a listed operational range in some descriptions around 300 kilometers, sea-skimming altitude, and a 200-kilogram warhead in the basic specification summaries available publicly. Tonight, the U.S. Navy didn't know what had been launched, if anything had been launched at all, because there was another possibility, a more terrifying one: that the air tracks were not missiles, that they were ghosts, decoys, electronic warfare projections designed to saturate the screen, force the Americans into defensive fire, and let the real threat slip in behind the confusion. At 4:25 a.m., the carrier's air boss ordered fighters to be ready to launch. On deck, crews moved with practiced urgency, the choreography of war performed without music. The problem with launching fighters at night in confined waters is that it looks like escalation, even if it's defense. At 4:25 and 30 seconds, another report came in, this one from a different destroyer on the perimeter. Unidentified small, fast contacts on the surface. Multiple, closing. Maybe speedboats, maybe something else. In the strait, small boats can appear suddenly, blending with civilian traffic until they break away. Now the strike group faced a classic asymmetric nightmare. Possible sea-skimming air threats, possible surface swarms, and a suspicious device in the water that might be coordinating the whole event. But what the crew didn't realize was that the real weapon might not be the missile. It might be the decision they were about to make. At 4:26 a.m., the cruiser's commanding officer requested clarification from higher authority. Do they engage the tracks? Do they wait for confirmation? Every second of waiting could be fatal if those tracks were real. But every second of action could be fatal to diplomacy. In the CIC, someone whispered the unspoken fear: if we shoot first, that's the headline. At 4:26 and 20 seconds, one of the radar tracks split into two, then three, like a mirage fracturing. Operators called it out. Anomalous behavior, inconsistent with a single missile. Another track blinked out, then returned slightly offset. That pattern, to experienced eyes, suggested deception. A trick. Something was playing with the sensors. At 4:27 a.m., the helicopter over the mysterious cylinder received a warning. Unidentified radio emissions detected near their position. The emissions were short, burst-like, too brief to triangulate easily. The device in the water might not be a mine at all. It might be a transmitter, sending a tiny packet of data to shore, or to another platform, or to something submerged nearby. And then something unexpected happened. At 4:27 and 30 seconds, the air tracks began to decay all at once, like a storm dissipating. Not shot down, not intercepted, simply fading. The formation held fire, a decision that would later be analyzed in briefings and war colleges. But the relief didn't last, because at 4:28 a.m., exactly 11 minutes after the first abnormal return, the destroyer's sonar room detected something moving underwater at very shallow depth, fast. Too fast for a conventional submarine in those waters. An unmanned underwater vehicle, a drone. Small, hard to track, and dangerously close. The sonar supervisor's voice cut through the calm. New contact, underwater, closing the formation. The carrier's captain was now trapped between the surface lanes and the unseen undersea approach. In a narrow choke point, the space to maneuver is an illusion. There are traffic patterns, shallow areas, civilian ships you can't just push aside. And mines, real or suspected, are uniquely effective here because they can deter and channel ships into predictable lanes, while giving an attacker plausible deniability and forcing time-consuming countermeasures. At 4:29 a.m., the helicopter crew made the call. They had eyes on the cylinder again. It was still there, still subtly oriented. They requested permission to mark it for recovery later, but now recovery was secondary. Survival came first. At 4:29 and 45 seconds, the underwater contact made a sudden course change directly toward the carrier's projected path. And that was the turning point. The strike group's formation tightened, escorts shifting positions with small but meaningful changes. The idea was simple. If something was hunting the carrier, you put steel in its way. If something was guiding weapons toward the carrier, you make the target ambiguous. At 4:30 a.m., a new order ran through the network. Increase readiness, deploy additional sensors, prepare countermeasures. The carrier's fighters were now on the verge of launch, engines ready, pilots strapped in, waiting for the final word. But the most dangerous moment wasn't the missile tracks. It wasn't the speedboats. It wasn't even the underwater drone. It was the question hanging over every console. What is the secret weapon? Is it explosive or informational? Is it meant to sink a ship? Or to force a reaction so dramatic that the strait becomes politically impassable? At 4:31 a.m., the underwater contact stopped. Just stopped. No gradual slowing. No drifting. A complete halt, as if it had reached exactly the position it wanted. And then the sonar room heard it. A faint acoustic chirp. A short digital-sounding burst carried through the water, like a handshake. The operators exchanged glances, because that sound wasn't an animal. It wasn't random. It sounded like a signal. And if it was a signal, then it meant the device wasn't alone. At 4:32 a.m., the strike group's electronic warfare specialists reported anomalies in the electromagnetic spectrum, small disruptions, brief spikes, not enough to shut down systems. But enough to suggest someone was probing, mapping, testing the edges of American detection, not to destroy, to measure, to learn. The carrier's captain now understood something that would define the rest of the night. This wasn't an attack meant to win. It was an operation meant to demonstrate capability. A reminder that in the strait, the U.S. Navy could be the strongest force on the water and still be vulnerable to a device small enough to fit on a fishing boat. At 4:33 a.m., the air picture stabilized again. No sea skimmer tracks, no immediate inbound missiles. Surface contacts remained at a distance, as if whatever had approached was content to hover at the edge. And the object in the water continued to sit there, quietly daring the Americans to do something about it. Over the next hour, as the strike group maintained control without firing a shot, the formation moved through the narrow corridor with slow authority, refusing to give Iran the dramatic reaction it might have wanted. The helicopters rotated. Sensors stayed hot. Fighters were launched in a measured posture, not a rush, maintaining cover without broadcasting panic. By dawn, the carrier strike group had cleared the most constricted portion of the strait. The world outside never saw the minutes where decisions almost outran certainty. Civilian ships kept moving. Oil markets kept breathing. Headlines stayed quiet. But the U.S. Navy didn't forget the cylinder. Later, when conditions allowed, a separate operation returned to investigate. The device was gone, not sunk, not destroyed, simply removed, as if it had never existed. And that absence became the final message. Because the true weapon that night may not have been a mine or a missile at all. It may have been the ability to place something, anything, near a U.S. Navy formation in the most strategic choke point on Earth, trigger a cascade of uncertainty, and then vanish without leaving proof. That is the kind of power that doesn't need to fire. It only needs to be believed. And as the carrier steamed into open water, crews on the flight deck watched the sun rise over a sea that looked innocent again. But in the CIC, the screens still felt haunted. Because the next time a faint return appears at 4:17 a.m. in the Strait of Hormuz, the decision window could be even smaller, and the 1 minute later might not end with fading tracks. It might end with fire.